You're listening to Talking Threat Intelligence, a podcast dedicated to uncovering the new challenges of today's threat landscape. Each episode, we connect with some of the world's leading practitioners to share stories from the front lines of corporate security. And now, on to the show.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Talking Threat Intelligence. I'm your host, Robert Value. And joining me today are Russ and Yariv Lis, co-founders of Verensics. Hey guys, the past few weeks, you published some really fascinating perspectives on LinkedIn. Yariv, you said that while organizations rely on background checks to screen new employees, they are becoming increasingly less reliable as a vetting work tool. And I thought that was really, really interesting. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So the challenge aspect with background check screening is that it was a good and valid tool probably 30, 40 years ago. But today, when people are switching a job very often and there's a lot of data breaches and a lot of opportunities out there, what end up happening is essentially the information that make its way to a background check screening is not really valid and reliable. Other than that, it is against companies, I would say, interest to actually report workplace incident. So if I'm, for example, running an accounting firm and I have one of my CPAs stole money, for example, I don't want it to go out. I don't want my customer to know that someone in my firm stole something. So typically what's going to happen with enough evidence that employee is going to be terminated for cause, I swap it out and that employee is now seeking for a new job and there's nothing on his record. So there's a gap between what people actually doing and involving to what you can find on their background check.
So a clear background check doesn't mean nothing ever happened.
Most likely something happened. Yeah.
Russ, you shared a really great example on LinkedIn, one of your personal stories. Would you mind sharing that with our audience?
Yeah, sure. Yes. So I posted pretty recently a fairly personal story about background checks. And I kind of went back and forth as to whether or not it would be a good thing or a bad thing to post something like that. Because it did have a lot of influence on me personally when Yariv and I were kind of building this company and building this platform. So we recognized that background checks are broken because companies are incentivized to avoid reporting, to not have anything reported. But the point of my story, and I'll kind of rehash that again a little bit just for your listeners here. So when I was a freshman in college, I did something really stupid. And I had kind of known even at that point, I wanted to go into some type of law enforcement, even though I was a journalism major at the time. So I was at a party. It was raided by the Dallas police. I went to Southern Methodist University. And so I said some things that probably shouldn't have been said after a few too many beers. And I and about 12 of my close friends ended up in the back of a police wagon. And we were booked for disorderly conduct and public intoxication. So those kinds of things really don't do well when you're going to apply for federal law enforcement. And I ended up working corporate security. And if those things had been on my record, when those organizations looked at me, I probably would not have gotten a second look. Now, what happened was I went back to my apartment, talked to some of my friends, and one of my friends was like, "Oh, I know a lawyer who can get you out of that." Okay. And it didn't even cost that much. It was like $150. And so talked to the lawyer, got out of it. It was nowhere on my record, nowhere to be seen. You do a background check on me now and it's completely clean. You know, I even did applying for federal law enforcement. You've got to fill out like the 50-page form. They go talk to your friends and your parents and all that good stuff. Then this one indiscretion was nowhere to be found. Now, there's really kind of 2 points to that story. And one is that a clear background check doesn't mean that nothing ever happened. It means that nothing's in the database. And those databases are increasingly more corrupted because you have lots of data breaches. You have companies not incentivized to report things. And there's holes you can drive a Mack truck through in that process. The second point is that if you reject a candidate based on what's in their criminal background check, you're probably making a mistake. It's really just a crapshoot. It's honestly like a 50-50. because you don't know the whole story. You don't have context to decide. So there's a lot of factors that go into a criminal history. And it might be that you just grew up in an area where there was a lot of contact with law enforcement and not positive contact with law enforcement. Well, I grew up in the suburbs of Houston. My only contact with law enforcement was with them driving, waving to me as they drove by while I was driving my golf cart around the neighborhood. So there was a very positive interaction there. But if I had happened to grow up in a place where there was not that positive interaction with law enforcement, I might have more on my record. And that's not fair. That's a biased way of looking at things. And so I think my whole point in that was that I made a mistake. Everybody makes mistakes. There's not a single one of us listening today that can say, you know what, I am without any indiscretion. Hire me now. So that was why I posted that. And it was really a very personal story for me because it was very influential in how we developed this platform and why we developed this platform, Verensics, because integrity and ethics is really everything when it comes to hiring and finding the right people. And Yariv actually has a great story. He was talking to a human resources director from a pretty large firm just a few days ago. And I'll let him share it, but he asked her why you do background checks.
Yeah, Yariv, you want to share that story?
Yeah, actually, she's a very successful CEO of this company. And I was curious to know exactly how they're vetting their employees because they're giving services to some other companies, just like a bank. And she had two main reasons. One was some of their users actually require that. And the second reason it was to sleep good at night. And it makes me feel that companies or decision maker sometimes working on auto mode. If you ask yourself, okay, I'm doing a background check and what the reason behind it, you probably want to get a background information. But do you know how the information gets to those background check screening, or you just rely on the name because it's known term that everybody uses, everybody keeps saying that they're using that, and no one ever bothers to dig and understand what's exactly the process, how those companies actually getting this information? What's the validation of this information? That was kind of an interesting aspect of it.
Well, I love the 2 points that you guys have mentioned, like both with going back to something you said, Russ, about the bias. And I think especially in today's job market where, there's such a struggle to find good candidates for the position. And then because of the bias inherent in the process, we could be discriminating or just completely avoiding a great group of candidates that, for whatever reason, just the neighborhood that they grew up in years ago as teenagers or where they are now. So it's something that I think you guys bring up a good point, that organizations, especially in today's labor market, where you don't have an endless pool of applicants for every position, to start reconsidering. It creates this kind of logistical backlog. The process is there are regulations around the background check process here in the US where you can't run a criminal background check until you've made a conditional offer. And that's meant to, protect the candidate. That piece makes sense. But what doesn't make sense is spending all this time talking to somebody, getting to know them, understanding their skills, running them through personality assessments, all that stuff, which takes a ton of time and money, only to run a background check and find out that, oh, the guy's been arrested for DUI twice. So now what do we do? He's going to be a forklift driver. Oh, well, what do we do now? It's a bit of the sunk cost fallacy. You've already invested this time, and then you don't necessarily want to go back on what you thought was a good decision. Exactly. So it doesn't do anything good for the candidate, and it doesn't do anything good for the organization. If you can find out that information up front and talk about ethics and talk about integrity and talk about honest and productive behavior up front, then you're going to get, one, it's going to save you a lot of time, but two, you're going to have just a better workplace culture. And really the only way to find out this kind of stuff is through solid interviewing. And what's really interesting is if you talk to people who are hiring managers and who are in human resources, and you ask them about the training that they've received or the training that they make sure that their hiring managers have to adequately interview people, it's usually met with blank stares. Well, the person was a good doer, and so we promoted them to manager, and now they're expected to go out and interview all these people and hire all these people, and they're not equipped to do it. So they
end up just kind of relying on this background check process as kind of a crutch, because it's like Yariv said, in his conversation, it's like the CEO said, oh, it makes me feel better and it makes me sleep better at night, knowing that I've conducted this background check on these people. And you're just not discovering 90 to 95% of the information that you need to discover. And because it's a passive process of where, I run a background check on you and they're just hoping you don't hear anything about it. And so we're just avoiding this conversation about ethics and character. And it's detrimental. And it might seem like it's intangible at first, but there are real metrics around this that you can really, when you start diving in and taking a look. I'm sure you're familiar with the NavX global benchmark. NavX, they're a company that does a lot of research into net management, investigations, that kind of thing. And so if you go in and you look at the NavX global benchmark for a 10,000 person company, you're looking at investigations of 1.6% of their people every year. Now, every single person that you're investigating was at one point your top candidate because you hired them. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about 160 people that were once the top candidate for a position that now are accused of sexual harassment or fraud or embezzlement or bullying or workplace violence. And so there's obviously something that's not right. And so that was kind of our point in starting to try to build this conversation and to really shine a bright light on what is a broken process and something that needs to be fixed.
Now, I'll jump and add to what Russ just mentioned. Those 160 employees that being investigated, it's probably not the first time that they have done what they have done. And the current company, once they're going to have enough evidence, they're going to terminate those employees for cause. And then those employees will go and get another job. And that information that they were investigation about something that they have done in the previous workplace shows nowhere. So the current situation create reality where we are shuffling bad actors. Mm. It doesn't mean that, if someone did something wrong is not hireable. But you need to know what he was doing and have a conversation and make sure that he understands that this company have very strict rules regarding certain activities. And you put it on the table. And that create an accountability and making sure that this person not going to do whatever he was doing, because now he know that the company that hired him knows about his past criminal behavior, and it was on the table.
One thing I'm also thinking of too is just these 160 people that you might run into in your company that are causing problems. Obviously, you have this incident which can be quite expensive to deal with, but it kind of creates a lot of problems throughout the organization. I'm a good employee. I don't want to work with other people that are very unethical and dealing with these kind of issues.
If you're part of an organization and someone in that organization is harassing you, or that they're stealing, or you've heard them make some really inappropriate comments or something like that, it just kills morale. And a follow-on to that is that it not only kills morale for your current employees, it can really kill your recruiting efforts, because your employees are the ambassadors of your culture. And they are your best pathway to new employees, because they are going to refer their friends. If they work for a really great company and they're really happy and they have a culture that they feel safe in, they're going to tell their friends that, hey, there's this job opening, come work with me. But if they're telling their friends, oh yeah, I've got this manager who is just doing this or that, and nobody's doing anything about it, and everybody knows, and they're just sweeping it under the table, guess who's not applying for your job?
Anyone in their network.
No, nobody in their network. The network now is I think, more powerful than ever. It's like, what Yariv referred to at the beginning of the conversation. Background checks might have been a little bit more meaningful 30 or 40 years ago, when there just wasn't the massive amount of information and interaction that you have now. But now it's an old tool that's being applied again and again and again. And it's not fit for purpose anymore.
Like the stakes when it comes to the hiring decisions, it's one of the most important things that organizations have to do is recruiting and bringing in the right people. But then I love the point that you guys made earlier, whereas a lot of good doers in the organizations get promoted to these manager roles, but they're not given any training on how to do it. I know when I was promoted into my first manager role, no one gave me the 101 of how to find someone that can do the job or how someone that's ethical. None of that was ever discussed. It was just, here's 20 minutes, talk to this person, try to make up your mind. And like, oh, I don't know, see how it goes.
And that's so, I would say, unfortunately, that's so normal. And it's kind of this like weird feedback loop where you're not equipping people with the right tools to make the right decisions. You hear all the time, especially in human resources, hire character and develop skill, but that's not really done. It's one of those things that it sounds nice to say and people give it a thumbs up and they like it on LinkedIn, but it's not really done in the real world because skill is easy to evaluate, right? You can say, okay, fill out this form. And if you can get all these math problems right, then you can work as cashier. But you're not getting any of that person's character. And if you're telling your managers, go talk to this person for 20 minutes and get to know them, you may as well just be throwing stuff at the wall and see what sticks. Because a real true interview, and we've done a lot of research into this just because of the nature of what it is we do with our platform, the best interview is called a structured interview. And interviews are squishy. They're one of those things that, just like this conversation, it can go in that direction or that direction, but you got to have some guardrails and you have to have a purpose for what it is you're trying to find out. And if you're not equipped with the right skills to do that or the right guidance to do that yourself as an interviewer, you're wasting everybody's time.
I think that's really interesting. That word that I included in there was the structured interview. And so maybe a good place to go next would then be, what are some of the things that your research has uncovered that maybe listeners could take away for how to conduct these interviews more effectively?
Sure. I'll need to talk a little bit about Verensics just because that's the nature of the beast and that's the nature of the research we've done. I think for the purposes of conversations around integrity and ethics, the most important takeaway is that the conversation should be non-accusatory. It needs to be non-adversarial. It just needs to be a conversation. But it also needs to be very almost stoic in nature is probably a good way to put it. Like there's ways of kind of interviewing emotionally, but you want to try to leave that emotion out of it as much as possible so that you're just discovering the behavior and you're discovering the attitudes. Even with that, some of the best interviewers I've ever met still encounter a person from time to time who is just not going to play ball. They're not going to give that person what it is that they're asking about, because they feel like they're higher up on Yariv has a great way of saying this, basically like they've got a lot more street smarts than this interviewer. And so they're not going to let this interview go the way they want. And that was part of why we developed Verensics the way we did, is because we developed it to ask those kinds of questions, those very pointed questions, while building rapport and while taking advantage of the fact that people are more likely to admit past misbehaviors or unethical attitudes to a machine as opposed to a person, because there's always that level of discomfort and that level of embarrassment. If I were to ask you, hey, Rob, tell me about what's the worst thing you've ever done?
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about that right here, right now.
Everybody's got something that they're a little bit embarrassed about in their past. But if you deliver very pointed questions in a very, again, kind of stoic way and a very structured way, and understand where you need to develop a follow-up question path and what that follow-up question path needs to be, then you can do it in a very efficient way without ticking anybody off.
We had a great analogy last week. I was talking about it with the confessional booth at church.
Oh, yeah.
Like when you're talking about your. So why don't we kind of go in a little bit of like what those structured interviews might look like. So like Russ, you're talking to me, you were sitting down, you wanted to get a sense of like what my character is. Am I an ethical person to have on your team? What would some of those questions look like or that kind of path?
That's an excellent question. And so it kind of depends on the rapport that you develop with the individual. I will mention that there is a very, very good organization that instructs on that kind of interview. They're called Wicklander-Zulawski. We have some good friends over there. And so I'll give them a little props right now because they've developed a very good process for getting to this kind of information. It really just kind of depends on what it is you're looking for. and I'm not trying to deflect the question, Rob, but it really kind of goes to what I said before, is interviews can be kind of squishy. And so you do need to add in some of those open-ended questions about, okay, tell me about your background, tell me about some of your skills. Why are you interested in this position? But when it comes to questions about integrity and ethics, you need to take a look at what kind of job they're going to be doing. Say it's a job in finance, and you need to be comfortable with saying, okay, in this position, you're going to have access to a lot of people's private information. You're going to have access to be able to shuffle money wherever you want to shuffle money within our control system. And we need to know what your value system is around that. If you had the opportunity to steal something, would you do it? Or if you had the opportunity to tell about, somebody's private information, would you do it? And you just need to be comfortable in asking those questions without it being accusatory.
So anyway, guys, we are coming up on the end of all the time I promised to steal from you this week. So why don't we take it home? What's the main takeaway you want listeners to remember from our conversation today?
I think there's a few things. First, you need to make sure that if your organization chose a process, regardless to what the process, let's say you want to stick with background check screening, that's worked best for you. You have the budget to do just that. Learn exactly what you get out of it, how you get the information that you get out of it. Measure how many investigations you have on your own employees every year, because if you are above the average, probably whatever you do is not the best practice to do. But gather the intel, make sure that you understand the process, what you're doing, the results. So whatever decision you're going to make is going to be more efficient decision.
I would say the main takeaway that I would want to give the people listening would be that the best indicators of job success are a mix of integrity and aptitude. If you have those two things, you probably have a successful hire. And I believe that there's not enough done on the front end to measure someone's character and someone's ethics to make sure that they're going to fit into an organization's culture and that they are going to work within an ethical framework. I think, there's a couple of points that I want to make there. And one is that it's extremely expensive to hire the wrong person. It's not always all that clear how expensive it is, but one great recent example is the new CFO of Moderna, who
saw that story.
was hired and I would assume went through an exhaustive background check, because you were talking CFO of a multinational corporation here, highly regulated, and worked for a day before they found out he was being investigated by his former employer for some sort of embezzlement or financial misreporting. And they paid him out $700,000 for a day of work. And
it's good work if you can get it.
But it's not just that $700,000, because now every single person at Moderna who works there is like, what the hell? Like, what is our management team actually doing? What is our leadership team doing that they would hire somebody like this? And so that's kind of my second point, is that there's a kind of hidden cost, because anytime you have one bad hire like that, whether they're, up here at the upper echelons of CFO, or if they're just entry level, if you have somebody who you hire and, say that they just ghost you, like they work for a couple of weeks and they just ghost you, you have someone else who has to pick up the slack. You have other team members who are all excited to onboard somebody new and they're frustrated and now they're weary of new people coming in. You have the hiring manager and recruiter who are perplexed and disappointed for not catching this sooner. Why didn't anybody catch this? And then you have people who are actually embarrassed to be on that team. And so now it's not just that $700,000 you paid out to the CFO who worked for a day. You now have a cultural problem that expands pretty substantially. And so going back to we like to talk about the life cycle of personnel risk. And if you can catch things on the front end, then you're going to diminish that risk as things move forward.
I think you guys got a really good message there and doing some interesting work. And so why don't you, as we wrap up, tell our listeners a little bit about the work you guys are doing at Verensics and how they can get in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. So at Verensics, we recognized very early on why we developed Verensics is because the background screening and vetting process is broken. as we mentioned before, and not to kick a dead horse, but background checks, it kind of is this weird kind of feedback loop of, organizations always go to background checks. We're going to conduct background checks to figure out what is going on in these people's background. But whenever we fire somebody, we're not going to actually report anything to the authorities. So we're continuing to use this tool that we're not feeding into. And so it's kind of this nothing coming in, nothing coming out, but we're still going to keep checking the box, and it helps us sleep better at night. And so we recognized that was a huge gap. And that's why we developed Verensics. And so what we developed in Verensics was a suite of smart questionnaires powered by rule-based AI that mimic a conversation in an interview, a structured interview about work misconduct, ethics, criminal behavior. And so we're bypassing all those disparate databases, and we're getting this information directly from the source. The Verensics questionnaires are geared towards 3 use cases: pre-employment screening, routine employee checks for code of conduct and insider threat, and also targeted investigations. And the whole idea is to use technology to not replace, but to enhance what has traditionally been a very time-intensive, cost-intensive, and resource-intensive process, and that's the interview. We're using technology to automate the parts that we can, to equip people to understand what's really going on with someone, and to be able to have a very structured follow-up conversation and get that out on the table. Not as a gotcha, but as a way of coming to terms with each other in an ethical framework.
All right, guys, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you so much, Rob. This is great. Always enjoy the conversation with you.
Thank you very much, Rob.
Again, that was Russ and Yariv Lis, co-founders of Verensics. Thanks for listening to Talking Threat Intelligence. Never miss an episode by subscribing to the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever else you listen to episodes. And if you'd like more insights on building a successful threat intelligence program, be sure to check out our resource page at lifegraphinc.com/blog. That's lifegraphinc.com/blog. And I hope you tune in next time.